Basic Brewing Radio is sponsored in part by the American Homebrewers Association. Want to get discounts on homebrew supplies and save money at craft breweries? Join the American Homebrewers Association and save at more than 2,300 AHA member deal locations worldwide and online. Members enjoy discounts on pints, food, and merch, and 10 to 30% off online orders. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing to check out the AHA member deals in your area and join the AHA. That's homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing to join the American Homebrewers Association to access thousands of members-only discounts. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, March 10th, 2022. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about homebrewing. This week, Chris Colby, author of the Homebrew Recipe Bible and Methods of Modern Homebrewing, joins me to talk about base malts as a part of our series on recipe development. Base malts are the foundation for any good beer, and we'll get an overview of several of the standard go-to choices. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows, and if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewer's logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. I'm recording this show a few days in advance this week. I'm going to get to spend some time with friends that I haven't seen in a while, so if there's any beer-related news that I'm not talking about, that's why. I'm staying away from other issues of the day other than to say the vodka that Steve and I have been using in our tincture tastings was made in Columbia, Missouri. Nobody asked, but I just wanted to clarify that. My toasted rye Doppelbock has finished fermenting. A couple days ago, the fermentation was slowing down, so I moved it up to the guest bathroom from the basement to do a diacetyl rest. And I didn't smell any off flavors or aromas coming from the airlock, but just to make sure it's not, butterscotchy or buttery in any way. But I think it's going to be tremendous. I didn't mean for it to be as big as it is, but, well, there you go. I'm going to wait a couple of days and take a gravity reading and taste how it's coming along. And now I've got to figure out what to brew next. What should I brew? I haven't brewed anything really hoppy in a while, and in looking at the website for our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from HighGravityBrew.com, I see that they have a Stumbling Dragonfly IPA kit on their homepage. This double IPA weighs in at more than 9% ABV, so no wonder that dragonfly's stumbling. It features carafoam, flaked oats, and flaked wheat, so it's probably going to be nice and chewy as well. Magnum for bittering, Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe for the whirlpool, and more Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe for dry hopping. Yum! The ingredient kits on HighGravityBrew.com are customizable, so you can choose extract or all grain, select from a long list of yeast choices, and you can even add a water treatment while you're at it with this one. Or if you have your own recipe, of course, you can hop over to the Build Your Own Beer page on HighGravityBrew.com and basically see the contents of a well-stocked homebrew store right there in one spot. And your running total is always visible at the bottom of the page as you shop. Pretty nifty. And of course, HighGravityBrew.com can help you take the pain out of propane with a Warthog electric system that Dave will build you his own self to your specifications. Just use the code EBC75BB to save $75 off your Warthog purchase. That's at family-owned and operated HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. Okay, we're starting with the basics in talking about recipe design and development. The foundation of any beer is going to be the base malt. So I invited Chris Colby to give us a general overview of what we're looking at when we see the bins of base malts at the homebrew store. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
We're going to talk about recipe development again. Mm-hmm. Last time it was brewing by the numbers, and we may not be doing one of these every week, but these will be sprinkled throughout the timeline. I'm talking to you about recipe development. We're going to be doing shows with Matt Giovanisi as well to talk about recipe development from his perspective, too. But this week, we're going from just explaining the numbers of brewing to actually getting into the ingredients. And the most basic ingredient is base malt, and that's what we're going to talk about this week. What kinds are out there, what strategies, how much, what characteristics, such as that. So I guess what we might want to do is go back to the very basic idea of what exactly is a malt.
Right. Malt is it's a grain that has gone through a certain process to make it suitable for brewing.
Called the malting process.
Well, the malting process, yes. Not too hard to figure out. And basically, you can malt a wide variety of different grains. But for beer, of course, barley is sort of overwhelmingly the grain that's malted the most. They do make wheat malt, and you can find specialty malts of other, rye. A tiny bit of rye malt is made, and oats and stuff like that. But generally, for beer, the largest ingredient by dry weight in any beer is going to be the malt. And what maltsters do is they take barley seed, which if you've ever planted barley, which I did. I had a field of barley in my side yard once. You came down and saw it.
Yeah, there's a video episode of us sitting in your barley field.
Yeah. Anyway, if you would take a barley seed and put it in your mouth and try to chew it, you would find out that it's hard as a rock, and it tastes sort of like grass because it's grass. So there's that. Anyway, malting transforms an incredibly hard seed that doesn't really, doesn't lend any flavor that you would want in a beer, and turns it softer, much softer, and also gives it some flavor on the outside. And they do this by germinating the grain. They germinate the grain. They remove the little rootlets come out of one end, and the stem, or what will be the stem, comes out of the other end, and they remove those, and so that they remove the evidence of the sprouting, and then they dry the grain and kiln it, which is basically putting it in a big oven-like thing that heats it, and that adds basically creates Maillard products on the outside, browns it very, very little, or depending on the heat, they're malts that they actually roast. But normal kilning dries and gives just a touch of that sort of flavor that we now describe as malty, because it's coming from malt. And so malt is something that a grain, usually barley, that has gone through the malting process and is now ready to brew. Specifically, it's soft, so you can crush it. The husks have a pleasant flavor to them, which little notes of bready, especially if it's wheat malt, but we generally describe as malty. And additionally, so that the process works, given that the seed has been sprouted, the enzyme systems in it that would normally help the kernel turn into, grow into an entire plant, those are activated, and those can be exploited by the brewer to break down the starch in the inside the kernel. Because in barley that's growing in the ground, it's much colder. You don't grow barley at mashing temperatures. Those enzymes very slowly break down the starch, feed it to the growing plant. In brewing, you heat that way up, and those enzymes just they just run through and convert all the starch into sugars within can be as short as 5 minutes, and if not slightly longer mashes. And typical homebrew mash is an hour, but you generally have conversion a lot longer before that hour is over.
So base malts are basically usually described as malts that can be made into a beer by themselves because they've got enough enzymatic power available because they haven't been, it hasn't been roasted out of them or kilned out of them. They have enough enzymatic power to not only convert their own starches into sugars, but to convert the starches of other specialty grains, specialty malts, and adjuncts that go in there with it. So the majority of your grain bill, or the amount of grain that you're going to put in your recipe, is going to be what we call base malts.
Right. If you attempted to make a recipe with just like all specialty malts or whatever, you would likely, depending on which malts you choose, you would end up with some unconverted starches, and also the flavor would just be, extremely. I don't know. Well, I don't know how to describe it. It'd be very, very intense, like too much, because these are meant to be used in small amounts, and then blah blah blah. So the base malts are among all the malts. They're kilned the least. They're kilned on the lower end of the temperature range for shorter periods of time than the darker specialty malts. And so, yeah, like you say, they retain their enzymatic power. They have a lot of starch in them to convert. And yes, they make up the bulk of your recipe.
And we should give a nod to gluten-free brewers who are using a whole new generation of malted grain malts that are not barley. And so that may be another episode way down the line as well about how you formulate recipes that are gluten-free. So the barley is not your only option as far as base malts.
In Africa, they make a lot of sorghum beers. Malted sorghum. It's not really at all popular here.
Yeah,
I've never even found one.
Oh, I'm sure there are people out there raising their hands right now. They're probably made malted sorghum beers. I've tasted some really tasty gluten-free beers. Anyway, so for example, if you're going to make your recipe using base malts, say a smash recipes, that's single malt and single hop, or single malt and lots of hops, I've found that generally 10 pounds or 4.5 kilograms of base malt will give me a beer of 5 gallons or 19 liters at around 1050, around there somewhere. That's just a general rule of thumb. You might get more, you might get less, depending on the efficiency of your mash tun and how much, as we said last time, how much your sugars you're able to get out of the mash. Let's talk about it. First of all, when you walk into the homebrew store, in the United States, most of what people use for base malt is called two-row. But I get email all the time from people who are not from the United States saying, why do you say two-row? Isn't most of the barley out there, under all the different names, isn't that two-row? So is that a legitimate criticism?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion in homebrewing about barley and barley varieties, and there's fundamentally two different kinds of barley, or well, you can think of it in a lot of ways. There's malting barley, and there's feed barley, and then there's winter barley, and then there's spring barley. But among both winter and spring barley, there are two-row varieties, and there are a higher number of row. There's 6-row, and there's also some that are called 4-row that are kind of modified 6-row. Yeah, and anyway, here in the United States, we grow both 2-row and 6-row, and most of what's grown in the United States is 2-row, but a significant amount of barley is grown as 6-row, primarily because it's malted such that it has a very high enzymatic power, and it's used in supplying that enzymatic power for beers that have a large amount of corn or rice in them. So yeah, when you call and in Europe it's all 2-row. So yeah, when we talk about 2-row, to Europeans we could be just saying barley, because that's what gets malted over there. But in the U.S., 2-row and 6-row base malts have been sort of shortened into 2-row and 6-row. So yeah, 2-row is not, if you're from a country where all the different barley varieties used for malting are malted, are 2-row, then it doesn't. But if you're in a country where it's our country that distinguishes the two, it makes a little bit more sense.
And when we talk about 2-row and 6-row, we're talking about the way the kernels are arranged on the head of the barley. 2-rows, right. 2-rows essentially one on either side, alternating up the stalk, and then 6-row.
Yes,
if you look from the top, they're kind of arranged all the way around the stalk.
Yeah, there's 2 rows that are offset. So you look down and there's sort of a what do you call it? 1, 2, is it hexagram looking shape. And it's kind of interesting. 2-row. There's a lot of misunderstandings about 2-row and 6-row. 2-row and 6-row, generally 2-row kernels are plumper than 6-row. But if you took the weight every year of the majority of 2-row and 6-row that was harvested and plotted it out, there would be 2 bell curves, and they actually overlap on a year where 6-row comes in well and the 2-row doesn't. 6-row barley can actually have plumper kernels. It doesn't usually work that way, but it can. And then also, I know in homebrewing there's a lot of dislike for 6-row barley. I think mainly because it's associated with brewing American Pilsners, and in the early days, everything associated with brewing American Pilsners was just like, but I don't know. I've grown 6-row before, and it's actually, there are some varieties that are really pretty cool, and you could potentially take 6-row barley and malt it into anything you wanted, but in practice in the United States, it's all malted into a very pale malt, designed to supply a lot of enzymatic power and not very much flavor and color.
And you sent me a map, or a couple of maps, of the Barley Variety Survey from the American Malting Barley Association. And boy, there's a whole lot of different names of all these different 2-row and 6-row varieties, and a lot of them we don't see in the homebrew store. Expedition, Mayflower, Hocket, Conrad. We don't see those.
You might be seeing them. When you buy 2-row pale malt at the homebrew store, it's very unlikely that it's labeled as to what variety is grown.
Mm-hmm.
Because those change all the time.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is that it's not marketed to us, or at least not yet. These small maltsters may start doing that more. But by the time it gets to us, the maltster, say Brees, has taken in different kinds of varieties of barley, and they've kind of malted them to a certain specification, and then they market that as a product. Brees calls it, I think, American Pale, but that's what it goes into the 2-row bucket at the homebrew store.
Right.
Let's talk for a couple of minutes about our friends and sponsors, Ricky and Kelly from Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies in Vermont. If you'll remember way back, we first met Ricky the Mead Maker as a young homebrewer when he came through town. We talked to him on the show and tasted some very fun and tasty beers that he had brewed himself. Well, Ricky hasn't forgotten his homebrewing roots, even though he and his wife Kelly run, successful commercial meaderies. He wants to share information with you to help you make delicious meads at home. That's right. Not only will you find delicious honey-based beverages on grownfell.com, if you click on the blog link, you can find homebrew recipes for favorites like Nordic Farmhouse, a Saison-style mead with cranberries, Old Wayfarer, a delicious amber mead that's easy to make, and Hop Swarm, a really tasty hopped mead. And of course, if you want to order some Grownfell and Havoc meads shipped to you, just so you can benchmark while you're on the site, you can do that too. And as I said last week, New Jersey is now open to get Grownfell and Havoc meads shipped directly to them. Check out all the honey-based deliciousness and homebrew information on family-owned and operated grownfell.com. That's GROENNFELL. So let's start breaking down some of these malts by characteristics, and I have bullet points for each of these that we may choose to apply or not for each of these. Color and diastatic power, origins, flavor characteristics, recommended percentage of malt bill, and then recommended styles for use. So since it's the outlier, let's start with 6-row. And we've already talked a bit about the diastatic power, but talk about the color and the diastatic power of what you'd likely find as 6-row.
Yeah, 6-row is lightly kilned, so it makes a light-colored beer. It's roughly the same color as a 2-row pale malt. Around 2 degrees Lovibond, sometimes a little lower, 1.8, that kind of stuff. And it's lightly colored. It's got a lightly malty flavor, and as you say, a ton of enzymatic power. Usually, it's measured in diastatic power. It's like a 160, which is very high on the scale of malts. US 2-row comes in at about 120. German Pilsner malts come in at about 90, and British pale malts can come in as low as 30 or 40. Very, a mild character, lots of enzymatic power, and it ends up, being used in beers where there's corn or rice or a mixture of the two that need, the starches need to be converted, because corn and rice corn is generally used as grits are usually what's used, and rice is just plain cooked rice. So they're not malted. They don't have any enzymatic power of their own.
So fairly neutral flavor characteristics.
Yeah, neutral flavor characteristics, and you can make a beer from straight 6-row,
mm-hmm.
and then the hops and it would just be a light colored, sort of. It would be basically pale or straw colored. It would be very light, and it would just have a light malty flavor.
And if you're using 6-row, what's the upper limit on, say, rice or corn percentage wise that you would put into a malt bill?
You can get it to 40 and maybe a little bit beyond.
Wow.
Quite a bit. It's and then as for the absolute limit, that's a good question. I mean, if you extended the mash a little bit, who knows? But I mean, in practice, 30 or 40 is the range that of grain adjuncts in an American Pilsner style beer.
Yeah, so we're talking American light colored lager essentially.
Yeah, and then most of those beers also there's usually a mix of 2-row and 6-row on the barley side. So yeah, I don't. I mean, it probably happens, but I off the top of my head, I don't know any breweries that use 100% 6-row as their base malt.
There's a brewery in Benton County, Arkansas, Hawkmoth, that uses a lot of 6-row. And I'm not, we did an interview a while back, and the beers were delicious. So, you can widen the scope of styles using 6-row. But it just may be a preference, and maybe something to play with in your recipe development.
Sure.
So, what we call two-row or American pale brewer's malt. So again, this is something that that is fairly light in color and pretty high in diastatic power.
Yeah, U.S. Two-row pale malt, sometimes called brewer's malt. Again, it's lightly kilned. It's basically kilned to the same color as most American six-row is. Lightly flavored. You can very easily make a beer with that being your only malt. If you want to make something called like a golden ale, which I know isn't the BJCP style, which is why I mentioned it. What's a blonde ale? I guess would be the BJCP certified name. You just make a light colored ale with it, and it works just fine.
And so it can, and again, it can be 100% of the malt bill. Yep. And if you go to, in the old days, I don't know if it's the same way now, but if you would go to a small to medium sized brewery, and if they had a silo, it's going to have two-row in it. It's just where most of the malt comes from.
Workhorse malt of craft brewing.
I mean, is that essentially does that essentially, those two broad categories, does that cover what is typically described as American malt?
Yeah, I mean, there's American, of course, maltsters make specialty malts and stuff like that. But in terms of base malts, just two-row pale or brewer's malt and six-row pale or brewer's malt are the basis of most beers brewed in the U.S., whether the big guys or craft brewers.
So let's move across the ocean. Let's talk about the base malts in the U.K. Is there a wide descriptor that you could spread over that? Are there tendencies that make the maltsters in the U.K. or the malts in the U.K. different from American?
Yeah, I mean, different varieties of barley are grown over there, and so there are differences, and there are also slight differences in the malting. But you can buy a British pale ale malt or a British pale malt, sorry, and that's basically interchangeable with the U.S. pale malt. British malts are sometimes kilned a little, just slightly longer. They have a lot less diastatic power, but they have maybe and again it varies. It runs the gamut. But some of them are known to have just a hint of like a biscuity flavor to them. Mm-hmm. So people, if you're brewing if you want to brew like a real English style bitter, or something similar to Fuller's ESB, or any of those sort of beers in the pale range of British beers, you can use the UK two-row malt. And they also make a malt called a pale ale malt, which is like the pale malt, only it's usually about a degree Lovibond darker. Instead of 2-ish, it's around 3, and it's just slightly darker version of a base pale malt. And then of course, when we're talking about barley varieties, a lot of homebrewers say like, oh, I like brewing with Maris Otter or whatever. Maris Otter is a barley variety. It's not a type of malt. You can take a Maris Otter barley and malt it to any specification you want. It's just it happens to be malted into pale ale or pale malt a lot, and that some people like that the combination of that variety and a specific maltster making the malt they make from it. So, and the Optic, another one that's a barley variety, not a style of malt.
And in my experience, the pale malts, quote unquote pale malts from the UK, produce beers that I would describe as more malty. They give, whereas if you just make a beer with American 2-row or American 6-row, it's going to be mostly clean, and it's a good palate for to lay on other flavors on top of yeast and hops and such as that. Whereas, like you said, the biscuity or the malty characteristic tends to come out more from the UK pale malts that I've used.
Yeah, if you made two beers that were basically a single malt, one was US 2-row pale malt and a British pale malt, a typical one or typical or average, somewhere in the middle of what they're doing. The beers would be very similar. The US would be like straw, would be very pale. The British one would have a hint of golden in it. It would be just a touch darker and have, just typically, again, there's a lot of different maltsters out there, a little bit more flavor to it, maybe a hint of biscuit. And then if you brewed one with just pale ale malt, that would be, just another tick up the ladder, would be, sort of moving into deep golden. And yeah, so those three would be on a bit of a continuum.
Now, what styles would you typically want to be brewing with the UK pale malts as opposed to American?
Well, I'd like to say ESBs, mostly because I have several friends who just get enraged when people use ESB as a style designator. So I'll say ESBs. And then just any British, they have an endless amount of names for their pale, bitters and pale ales and best bitters, special bitters. Any of those light, relatively light in color, relatively pale British style beers, all those malts are, that's what they're made for.
Mm-hmm.
So that, it works well. And I would bet nearly anything that the reason that most homebrew recipes specify a 60-minute mash rather than like a 10-minute mash is that a lot of homebrewers started using, British malts, which take longer, usually not a whole hour, but we're used to brewing beers where the malts are going to take a little while to convert themselves, and I don't know, it's weird. I still mash for an hour no matter what my almost no matter what my recipe is, because I always think that I'm skipping something if I mash for like 5 minutes and to do an iodine test and it's done. I'm like, oh, okay.
Well, I keep looking at my refractometer, and when my refractometer stops going up is when I stop mashing, essentially.
That's a good way to do it too, because I also like beers on the dry side, so I figure I'm going to let this mash go out, and not even with a negative iodine test, there's still starches to be converted. They just fall below the level that you can detect that with an iodine test. So.
And we should say that everything we've talked about so far, and maybe everything on the list, are things that can be converted using a single temperature, single step mash.
Yeah. Basically, these days, all malts they're malted in order to be used in a single infusion mash. There are a few specialty malts that are under modified and need a step mash, but yeah, basically today the malts are malted in order to be used in a single infusion mash. And if you're gonna try to do a step mash because you think you're being authentic to a style or whatever, you better do some research and get a malt that's appropriate to use a step mash on, because otherwise generally step mashes have on a fully modified malt have the tendency to remove foam and just sort of they just keep going, essentially, because mashing is an extension of malting. The maltster modifies the barley seed into malt, and then the brewer modifies the malt into wort. it's a continuum. So, uh, if it's been malted such that it's supposed to have a single infusion mash, you can end up overdoing it in the mash with the step mash. Particularly, you can degrade a lot of proteins that are important for uh, head retention if you don't watch out.
And you do more work. And you don't have to.
Yeah, there's that. And you generally, I mean, there are homebrewers who just are completely enamored of decoction mashing, and there is an actual flavor to malt or beers that have been made with a decoction mash, and uh, you can learn to pick it up. But yeah, it is a lot of work, and you can mostly sort of just change your malt bill to get around most of it, unless you're fixated on that. And then you just have to seek out, if you want to make the best beer possible, you just have to seek out undermodified malts.
And let's move over to anything else you want to say about the UK base malts?
No, not really. I mean, there's a lot of maltsters over there, and they make it seems to me that they make a wider variety of pale malts than U.S. maltsters do, because the U.S. maltsters are all the 1.8 to 2 degree Lovibond, very pale, very enzymatic malts, whereas over there they have both pale ale malt and pale malt, and just different maltsters have different characteristics, and of course they have different varieties of barley that they start with. So yeah, they're very similar, but there's if you really get serious about brewing English style beers, look around and try to find different pale malts or different pale ale malts from different maltsters and try them out, because they are different.
Yeah, do some small batches.
Yeah,
and taste your ingredients. So let's move over to the continent. What about Belgium? Lots of good malt coming out of Belgium.
Yeah, they have their own Belgian pale malts, and again, if you were to brew one and compare it to like a U.S. and English, it would be very similar. It would be light in color. A Belgian pale malt has, I don't know how to describe it. I would just call it Belgiany, which is recursive. But yeah, there's a different character to at least the Belgian pale malts I've tried, and here's the big surprise: they work really well on a lot of Belgian style. You're making a Belgian style beer, and yeah, they're just another option. I mean, I remember one year I had several beers advance to the second round of the National Homebrew Contest. This was back when I bothered to enter, and I thought, I'm going to rebrew all these beers so that they're nice and fresh and blah blah blah. So I get to my homebrew store and look for my usual, like I think most of the beers I wanted had English pale ale or English pale malt, and a few with US, and they were all out, and they had Belgian pale malt. And so I said, oh, all right, I'll just use Belgian pale malt. What's the difference? And they all came out with, it wasn't bad, but it was just a very different sort of cast to them. And it was like not, of course, if you're trying to brew to style, it was noticeably not what the style was supposed to taste like, or at least there was an extra little flavor note that didn't, wasn't what I was shooting for, at least. I mean, fine beers. I drank them. But
and how would you characterize that note? I mean, how were they different from American?
Yeah, Belgian-y. I don't know. They don't. There's not a. I can't think of a common descriptor that. I mean, I almost want to say there's a slight phenolic edge, but that's not quite it either. I mean, phenolic edge has some negative connotations that wouldn't really apply. But yeah, it's just different. If people are interested, brew, like I say, brew a light beer with some English malt, brew with some U.S. malt, and brew them with a pale malt or a Belgian pale malt, and just try them. And at that point you'll get it. Like, you might not have the vocabulary to explain what it is, but you'll go like, oh yeah, I get it.
And what's the difference, say, between the malts we've talked about so far and, say, a German Pilsner malt?
Yeah, German Pilsner malt is essentially, the German two-row pale malt, but they call it Pilsner malt because it's almost, it was designed, that malt type was designed to go into Pilsner lagers. So yeah, it's two-row malting barley. It's very low in color, around 2 Lovibond. Again, if you were to stack it up against the other, it'd be very similar to the U.S. or Britain, probably in between those two, in terms of color and the flavor. Again, the very mild. It'd be a very like a clean characteristic, I would say, to Pilsner malt that it's hard to describe. It's very smooth, and very typical of obviously of what the malt tastes like in an actual Pilsner beer. But yeah, essentially, it's the German equivalent of U.S. two-row pale malt or British two-row pale malt, and it can be used in as the base malt for wide variety of styles. And here's the shocker: lager beers. Yeah, it's almost as if German maltsters malt barley for German beers. Yeah,
and American maltsters also make Pilsner malt as well.
Yep. You can. There's a lot of different little tweaks that you can do during the malting process to change. You can have a malt that's essentially the same color and a lot of the other specifics, but they can, depending on some little variations during it, you can change the character. You can also use a specific barley variety to do that, and you can also just get your marketing department to label two-row pale ale Pilsner malt.
Now, back when I first started brewing with all grain, it was said that you got to boil. If you got a lot of Pilsner malt in your wort, you got to boil for 90 minutes because of the low. It's the low color. It hasn't been killed for a long time, and so there's a lot of potential DMS or corny flavor that you got to boil for a long time to boil that stuff off. Was that true, or is it true now?
Pilsner malts can have some DMS in them. Generally, it's a 60-minute boil is going to be fine. And I mean, you can, as a home brewer, if you're boiling and suddenly it just smells like a ton of corn coming off then maybe take that as a hint that you need to boil a little longer. But most of the time, most modern fully modified Pilsner malts aren't going to cause that much problem. And again, it's something that for U.S. two-row malts, the maltsters they do it specifically so that characteristic doesn't arise. In Pilsner, you might tweak the process so that there's a little bit of that, because people almost as a very minor characteristic. Some people like that, in the aroma of a Pilsner, as long as it's not overbearing. But generally you shouldn't have to boil for 90 minutes. But then again, maybe you need to. It's one of those things. You have to go malt by malt, and different maltsters. Make the Pilsner malts are all maybe all the same color, but they might not all have the same same barley variety underneath them and the same the process. There's a lot of little tweaks in the way malt is produced that can have some interesting results, which we'll get into in producing roasted grains, especially.
Yeah, I think I've even done short boils with Pilsner malt, like 30 minutes, and they came out just fine. So, maybe it's a modern thing with modern malting methods. Let's talk about our friends and sponsors at Imperial Organic Yeast. I told you how well the L26 Pilgrimage worked on my big, toasty rye Doppelbock. Well, normally, I would have made a 2-liter starter with a beer as big as 1071, especially fermenting cool in the basement, but I didn't have to knock the dust off my stir plate for this batch because the pouch of imperial yeast got to work right away, even without a starter. Those 200 billion cells give me the confidence that the lag times I used to experience are a thing of the past. And with a recommended shelf life of 4 months, I don't have to be in a panic if my brew day gets delayed for one reason or another. And on top of that, top-notch technical support and customer service, and imperial yeast rises to the top in my mind, just like that layer of happy yeast that I see in my carboys when I brew nowadays. Ask your local homebrew shop about imperial organic yeast and check them out at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. What's a Vienna malt?
Vienna malt is it's a malt style that's a little bit darker than the normal pale malts. Vienna is you can kind of sort of think of it as the German equivalent of pale ale malt. It's just a shade darker. You can make an all Vienna malt, and it turns out pretty much a middle golden color. It's a little bit more bready, malty flavor to it. It's a really nice malt, especially I use it a lot in beers that if I have, if it's going to be a light colored beer and the base is mostly just a 2-row pale malt, I'll throw in maybe 10% Vienna to just adds a little bit more of a malty character. A well done Vienna malt is great.
Sounds like something you might want to brew like an Oktoberfest beer or a Fest beer of some sort.
Yeah, you could. I mean, a lot of those beers lean heavily on Munich, which is sort of the next darker malt in that series. But yeah, you can make a fantastic Oktoberfest style beer with, a blend of Pilsner, Munich, and Vienna.
And let's talk about Munich. You mentioned Munich. What's Munich?
Yeah, Munich is just another step darker. Their Munich malts are a lot of times in the 6 to 8 degree Lovibond range, and or 6 to 10 really for the light Munichs, and then the dark Munichs get up to like 20, but they're still pale malts. They'll still you can brew 100% Munich beer, and or even 100% dark Munich beer. You want to watch that you get starch conversion from that, but you still should. You couldn't probably use like all Munich and try to convert any corner rice, but then you wouldn't be doing that unless you were brewing some beer of your own creation. But yeah, just slightly darker pale malts, lighter than the light. Mostly, there's exceptions to all of this, but lighter than at least the vast majority of specialty malts, and still a pale malt, still capable of converting all its own starches.
Yeah, and I've even brewed for the sampler series. I brewed a 100% 20 Lovibond Munich, and it worked. I mean, it converted, and it was interesting. I can't remember. I don't know that I was bowled over by the character of of that 100% 20 Lovibond Munich beer, but it's possible. You can do it.
What was the color? Like a deep golden?
Yeah, it was a deep amber color, kind of a deep copper. A penny that's been around for a while. And it was kind of a little bit maybe a little bit too sweet in my memory. Just because, there might have been some residual sugars left over. But it's possible and something to play around with, especially, like I say, for a small batch.
Both Vienna and Munich are the malts from different maltsters can be, although, roughly in the same color and other specifications range can vary quite a bit. And then there's American, or U.S. Vienna and Munich, which can be very different from the German or other continental European malts. So yeah, if you plan to use like a lot of Vienna or Munich, look around and try to find from different maltsters and try them out and find one you like, because there are differences despite being labeled the same.
And let's switch from barley to another base malt, technically base malt that can be brewed 100%. I've done it, but whether you want to or not is another thing. But that's malted wheat, and there's two different kinds of malted wheat that you'll see in the homebrew store.
Yeah, there's typically red and white are the two different kinds, and if I remember right, red is sort of the preferable one for brewing German-style Hefeweizens, and white is the preferable one for brewing sort of more Belgian-style wheat ales. But very, generally wheat malt is very lightly kilned, in the range of barley pale malts, and they have an increased amount of like a bready, because bread is largely made from wheat, flavor to them, and great for brewing German Hefeweizens, great for brewing Belgian, any of the Belgian style ales with a lot of wheat in them, and good just for American brew pub style beers that have some wheat. If you're going to brew an American style wheat beer, like it's sort of like a Hefeweizen with clean ale yeast, yeah, I'd go with a little bit of maybe like 40% white wheat malt.
Yeah, I've brewed 100% wheat beers, and they've worked out fine because I have brew in a bag. The thing that you want to watch out for if you mash traditionally and have a traditional lauter tun is wheat gets sticky, and so you might wind up with a mash tun that's full of glop that you can't get out unless you can pick up the bag and squeeze it, like I do with my 100% wheat beers. And the character from 100% wheat beer is nice. It's not, a lot of the wheat flavor that people think that comes from wheat actually comes from yeast in certain styles. So it's fairly clean and not really too gloppy. But in traditional wheat styles or wheat beers, what is the percentage that's barley and what is the percentage that's usually wheat?
Yeah, in a German Hefeweizen, there should be at least 50% wheat malt, and 50 to 70% wheat malt is the typical range, and then the rest of it is just Pilsner malt or some sort of pale malt. Generally, unless they're making a Dunkelweizen, there's not other specialty malts in a normal German wheat beer.
And last, something that's not on your list is malted rye, which can technically convert itself, but it's so gloppy that I've recommended it for if you're going to make like a 2% beer, you can do 100% rye, but unless you do like a beta glucanase rest or something like that to loosen up the sliminess, you really got to be careful there with rye.
Yeah, rye in the United States, rye malt and also unmalted rye, a lot of it is made into sort of rye IPAs. Sierra Nevada has a very popular rye IPA, and a lot of other places do too. But yeah, as you say, like it's not ideal as a base malt or an only malt, because yeah, you're gonna run into a lot of gumminess in the mash, stickiness.
Slimy. Well, we've talked about a lot. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's useful. It's good for me to refresh my memory on a lot of this stuff as well. So I'm selfishly getting information too. And I appreciate it. We've been getting email from people who want to hear different topics along these lines. So we're going to be taking those suggestions and comments into consideration, and maybe I'll remember next time to read one of those emails and and give some credit. But Chris, I look forward to the next time.
Yeah. What are we talking about next time? Specialty malts?
Yeah, I think that you and I are going to talk about specialty malts. It may be, or specialty grains and specialty malts. It may be a few weeks, but we'll get back together. Stay tuned. Well, thanks again to Chris for the overview. What are your favorite base malts, and why? How can you tell a difference? Also, don't forget to send me your suggestions for topics to cover under the umbrella of recipe design and development. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. So until next time, until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well, stay tuned. So long.